Students of poetry, welcome to the last lesson in our poetry unit. You followed Robert Frost from Good Hours to Fire and Ice. And while you may not have miles to go before you sleep, you do have a few more things to do before we finish this unit. For as long as humans have been using written communication, there's been poetry. And while poetry is difficult to define because it takes on so many different forms, styles, and purposes, there are a few consistent principles of that genre. First, there's word choice. Poets scrutinize diction to select the exact words that will have a denotation, or a literal meaning, that can open itself up, figuratively, to symbolic representation of abstract concepts, and purposely use the powers of connotation to set a mood, evoke a feeling, or tap into a concept somewhere deep in the reader's consciousness. Next, there's phrasing. Poets aren't tied to the rules of prose with its complete sentences and perfect grammar. Poets know those rules, but they exercise poetic license to create phrases that produce a certain sound. Yes, the sound carries meaning. So, in addition to purposeful phrasing and line breaks, poets use devices like assonance, consonance, and alliteration. They might employ meter and rhyme scheme, and they may or may not use capitalization, punctuation, and complete sentences. It's up to the poet, and the poet's choices always help convey the poem's meaning. Poets generally layer meaning into their poems. You saw how Frost's allusions to the ancient Greek myth in which Sisyphus had to push a boulder up a hill, only to have it roll back down, forcing him to repeat the process over and over, opened up the potential to read Frost's Mending Wall poem as an allegory for the futility of man's struggles. Wow! Finally, poetry is intended to create images and stir feelings. So, whether a poem tells a story or describes a feeling or experience, its intent is to tap into the soul of the reader. And that's where the real power of poetry resides, in the lasting impact even just a few words can make. Some poets have used their art to record history and immortalize historical figures. We've all heard of Paul Revere, but perhaps the reason has something to do with the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote,
"Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year."
Longfellow wasn't born until 32 years after Paul Revere's ride, but he grew up in a young country where the tales of the Revolutionary War were still being told by those who had lived through it. And because Longfellow used a combination of iambs and anapaests, and because Longfellow wrote his poem in a series of couplets, it's pleasant to the ear and easy to remember. Paul Revere can thank Longfellow for his ongoing popularity. Throughout history, poets have been influenced by historical events, and in turn, they've immortalized these events, glorified individuals, and preserved the stories that shaped cultures. Poets are also influenced by events that take place in their personal lives. Edgar Allan Poe was orphaned at just 3 years of age, separated from his 2 siblings, and raised by cold and miserly distant relatives who provided him with a good education, but no love and no money. He went on into adulthood to experience the death of his young wife to tuberculosis. No wonder his writing was filled with darkness, like the poem Annabel Lee, in which he wrote,
"The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee."
Now, Poe's wife wasn't named Annabel Lee, But do you notice the theme of love and loss that was undoubtedly influenced by Poe's personal experience? This theme resonated over and over in his work. Like Poe and Longfellow, Robert Frost was influenced by the events of his time and by his personal experiences. We see that reflected in his body of work. In your final week of this poetry unit, you will read about the life and times of Robert Frost. As you read, consider the ways in which Frost's historical context and personal experience shaped his poem. From the leaves that elude this narrator's embrace to his projection of how the world might end, what themes and images seem to appear again and again? Which poems seem to echo the poet's experiences, and which historical events may have influenced his poetry? After reading about Frost's life and times, you will write an essay about the ways in which Frost's historical context and personal experiences influenced his work. And when you're finished, you may want to look back at the poetry that you've written during this unit and consider how your own life and times have influenced your creative and clever expression.
Hey, hey.